tens of millions of engineers would become AI engineers versus like hundreds of thousands of ML scientists. That would beget the need for an application sort of framework for AI and tooling for that computing environment. There's randomness to it. How do you measure excellence of it? And there's an opportunity for Build to empower every engineer becoming that.
Miles, we first met in, I think it was 2016, and then we met in person in 2017. I've wanted to make it happen since then. Respectfully, you made me wait 6 years, but I'm so glad that we managed it. So thank you so much for joining me.
A pleasure to finally do it. A long time coming.
Now, man, I would love to start with your entry into venture. First off, how did you make the first move into venture from college or university?
Yeah. I would say worth winding the clock back a little further than just there, sort of where the motivation, the inspiration kind of incepted in many ways. I actually grew up in the UK. We're here recording in the UK. And I went to the US because my parents remarried. And my stepfather, who's very much a father to me, was an entrepreneur. He founded one of the very first e-commerce software companies, powered a bunch of the big sites at the time. And when I moved, he'd sort of taken that public and the .com. And when we moved over to the US, he was starting another company out of our living room, our kitchen table, actually. It wasn't a garage. It was probably actually in the East Coast, a little too cold in the winter. It was the kitchen table. And it was like 2 people, him and a friend, and then 3 people, and then 4 people, and then 5 people. I sort of didn't really know what it was in many ways, but it was like really inspiring to come home from school and see him working with friends and working hard and talking about new ideas. It was e-commerce software again. And so I kind of, at that point, in many ways, the American dream was his lived experience. He's a Korean immigrant. The American dream was sort of mine in some sense, coming to the US from the UK. And that love of being around people like him and his friends who were creating kind of just got into the blood in many ways. And then fast forward, I didn't know what the job was to do things with those sorts of people per se, but I knew that was really intoxicating. And fast forward to sort of around the tail end of college, New York City and sort of app development, was having a really vibrant moment. In some sense, it was sort of really early in cloud, obviously. This is like 2010, 2011, 2012.
So Rails, this is like Tumblr days.
Yeah.
Foursquare.
Rails, Foursquare, in New York City at the time, Warby Parker, Harry's, MakerBot, GroupMe. There was this idea, it was funny to look back on at the time, but there was vibrant sort of, in many ways, the movie of the time of inspiration was probably was the Facebook movie,
the social network. This is what inspired me to venture.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that you could be a kid and you could build something in college. We were doing that, we were hacking around, nothing like Facebook, but we were hacking around with just fun ideas. You were totally empowered. Rails was a framework at the time that had blown up and made it easy to build sort of modern web apps. Heroku was out there. So it was really exciting. You sort of felt like you got handed all these superpowers and could use. And there was this question at the time of, could you have a Silicon Alley? Like, could there be tech built outside of the valley? Here in the UK, it was sort of talked about as, could you have a Silicon Roundabout? And there's an idea that could you build companies elsewhere? And I was on the East Coast and spending a lot of time in New York. And I got to meet Josh and this guy, Will Gabrick, and they were sort of setting up Thrive. And we just started spending a lot of time together, talking about ideas, pursuing them, trying to help founders. And it was infectious, that excitement. And so they invited me to join the team as I finished up. And turns out wanting to be around amazing folks like my father and sort of that ecosystem, burgeoning at the time, serendipity met and been running ever since.
Can I ask you, you can call yourself the night before your first day joining Thrive with Josh there and give yourself a piece of advice.
Yeah.
Knowing all that you do now, what would you say to yourself?
I knew it at the time, but it's sometimes, if you don't have as much historical context, it's sometimes hard to necessarily really fully appreciate the wave in terms of context and history and specialness that you're on. And if you go and look, call it 2012 to like 2022-ish timeframe, cloud spend went from like 10 billion to 300-400 billion. Like there's a chart that, the banks put out, right? It's sort of like, this is AWS spend and, Azure spend, they classify, and all of the cloud SaaS, like 10 to like 350, 400 billion. I forget the latest number. But over that 10-year period, that's what happened. And that is just a tectonic shift And I knew I was spending a lot of time in cloud developer products, cloud application products. But I remember at one point I wrote this sort of analysis of like this was before they went public, Shopify versus Etsy. And it's funny enough, actually, Harley, the COO of Shopify, actually cold emailed me, having read this little post saying, "Hey, you want to come like work at Shopify?" I was at a conference the other day spending some time with him, and I reminded him of this, and he dug up the email. He was like, "Yep." I was like, it's a lesson I give to so many founders now. Like, you should always be proactively recruiting. This was 2014. And so it wasn't like Shopify was small anymore. But anyway, with Shopify versus Etsy, there should never be a versus. It should just always have, in some sense, been and. Like it was such a big force that so much was still coming online. So I'd almost be like, you tell yourself, don't try to be too smart in many ways in some of it all.
I am so with you, and I love that in terms of don't try and be too smart. But then history shows you, and you said about kind of Harry going off script, and so we are, but like, fuck it. History shows yourself that being second, it often generates so much less value than being first. Uber, Lyft, Etsy's an incredible company at 9 billion, but Shopify's at 85. It does matter, no?
Absolutely, and obviously there's relative in it, but in many ways, all of these were still sort of being first, right? Etsy and Shopify were different, right? We don't need to drill into those two specific, but they're different. They serve different users, slightly different needs, and both can work, especially when it's still that early. And sort of the thing I remind myself, if it was 2013 again, 2012 again, is like, it's so early in all of that. I think another connected though to that other piece would be advice and sort of reminders I give myself always, but reminders I give other people really getting into venture, is there can be so much terminology, so many frameworks, SaaS metrics, this, MAU-DAU ratios, that you feel like there are all of these kind of rules and vernacular and jargon. And the most important thing is always like, who's the user and why do they care? If you ground yourself in that always, instead of sometimes this sort of like whirlwind of other, framings from investing, it'll probably serve you pretty well. I almost think certainly every company I recommend it to, more investors should sort of do it, is you get started with investing books, which are useful, obviously, but the book like Working Backwards, which is about Amazon's culture, which is working backwards from the customer, serves all teams well in almost all cases. And in investing, that simple idea of like writing the product launch announcement, like there's a version of that in many ways, working backwards as an investor, where you're like, what's the mo? It's if you lose sight of the user, you get lost. That really should be the tether to reality. And so that would be a big constant reminder, and certainly emphasis to an early investor.
There's so many threads that we'll pull on in a minute, but when you say who's the user, it's funny. I spoke to Vince Hanks before the show, and when I had him on to discuss actually his investment in OpenAI, he said that was the single biggest thing that he's been taught by being at Thrive. This maniacal focus on who's the user and solely focusing on value derived. When you think back on your time at Thrive, I think it was six years and 9 months, according to the trusty LinkedIn. What were one or two of your biggest takeaways? Because it was such a meteoric journey for you and for Thrive.
Maybe I'd say three things that jump out to me as lessons from Josh. There's lots of skills and the like investing, but sort of maybe ways of looking at the world and being in the world are the lessons that you really carry with you the longest. One from Josh would really be that kindness and competitiveness don't have to be oil and water in business. And sometimes the cliches treat those as opposite poles of a magnet. You're either a pushover or you're doggedly and I think he really showed that they can be in harmony, and that's a really special thing. So kindness and competitiveness. Another would be sort of this idea like, yes, you can. And I think belief in someone's potential and someone's possibilities is such an amazing gift. He certainly gave me that gift. And I've watched him give many others that gift, many founders that gift of like, yes, you can. Real belief in their potential. And it's a beautiful thing to give someone, and it's an amazing way to go through the world and keep with you.
Just on that point, I'm always in awe of his ability to spot talent. When you look at your Chris Pikes, when you look at obviously you, but your Will Gabricks, even Vince now and Kareem, who've scaled incredibly well internally. What do you think makes Josh so good at talent detection on the investor side? Because I want to be as good as he is.
I think the track record obviously is phenomenal in that regard. A big part, he talked about this recently on a podcast, in many ways is sort of probably a combination of really an appreciation of will over skill. Some people will hire for proven ability, you already have the knowledge or the like. And again, it's back to this idea of like, yes, you can, and a belief in someone. It's really a gift of a confidence in someone's work ethic and determination. And yes, they have to have the mental capacity and the intellectual capacity and all those things, right? But you can know that in someone. But the person who will love it and is passionate about it, I have 6 younger siblings, and sometimes I think about, what lessons I'd like to potentially impart as I go sort of on them. And you think about these days, everyone talks about follow your passion. And I kind of believe that for sure, but I believe it for the reason, not where everyone else necessarily talks about it, but you should follow your passion because you'll just work harder. And if you think about compounding 10 extra hours a week, 50 hours a year, 500 hours, not far into the future, you've learned more, you've caught up, you're better, and you're always improving yourself. And so that belief in yes, you can, that belief in sort of will over skill in many ways, I think has, along with sort of some base conditions, leads to a really powerful compounding of individuals' kind of abilities.
I always laugh because people always say, Harry, you run the media company and now the funds, like, how do you do it? And I say, well, if you add 2 10-hour days on Saturday and Sunday, it's quite easy. There you go, a long way. Yeah,
which is why you should be passionate.
Yeah,
so you can work more.
But also, actually, passion often comes from when you're good at something, and you get good by doing more of it.
Yeah.
And so I think the hard work starts. Like, no one goes to the gym and is like, yes, I'm so good at this.
Yeah.
It comes from going again and again, and then you start enjoying it.
Yeah. I just saw quoted Stephen King on writing, talking about writing. It's like, the best, it's not that they're necessarily better, they just start.
Yeah. My favorite is actually, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter.
Exactly.
I love that.
Exactly.
What was the third one? Sorry, I cut you off there.
The third one would be this, again, the greatest gift of things you sort of carry with you as ways of being would be what I might call impatiently patient. Again, sort of a duality that almost shouldn't exist. Which is, why not now? Why not yesterday? Like hyperactive all the time, but still a really high standard and really patient for the long term. And so that combination of like being fully present, like fully engaged, new and active, but also like high standards and not rushed. And that duality, I think, he really lives. And having a mentor like that early on who can show you that through their lived experience is a really powerful thing to carry with you.
I find that the hardest thing building a firm today, like the need to move things forward every day, every week, but then also appreciating that Benchmark isn't built in a year or 6 months,
right.
And things compound. It's a hard duality to reconcile.
Yeah, and patiently patient.
So we mentioned kind of Benchmark there. From me, when you made the move, I'm sure you had a lot of people call you and just give you advice. You've obviously built an incredible set of friends, community around you. What advice did you get when you joined Benchmark?
People, it's in many ways, I spent not a lot of time, but a decent amount of time in venture. And so knew of different firms in many ways. So I didn't really go and get advice on making the decision. The only person I really asked was my wife, and I was like, are you really up for moving to California? And both of our families are on the East Coast, and family's important to both of us. She'd grown up entirely on the East Coast, didn't have friends as in many ways out there, and didn't have a life out there, and we wanted children, and so we set roots out here. And so the main question was, are you really up for that? And we'd only been married in many ways also, like 6 months during the pandemic, and she was fully up for it. And so that was the biggest question.
Did Fenton and Gurley give you any advice on joining?
I wouldn't say there was ever, and in some sense we're always, as we go through it, like giving each other thoughts and feedback and nagging each other to be better, obviously. And so there wasn't sort of like some entry indoctrination or whatever. In many ways, it was you be you, like you be you, totally kind of unfiltered and as authentic as you are, and the best version of you will be the best investor. And I think in many ways, when you get rid of structure, and there's no like level to be had, or nothing like that. The just be yourself is in some sense the hardest thing.
I think a hard thing is a lot of people don't know who they are as an investor. It's funny, one of my friends just joined one of the biggest firms in the world, and he said, should I do this? Should I do this? Should I do this? I said, they hired you for you. Yeah. Like, they hired you for what you've done already. Just keep doing that. And I think that's the most important thing to remember. How was the first partnership meeting? I always remember Pat Grady at Sequoia, who's a great friend of mine, said after 6 months, Roloff said to him, do you need to see a vocal coach? Because you don't seem to be speaking. How was the first partnership meeting at Benchling?
We have no deal flow list, no sheet, there's no memos. There's no data room presentations.
How do you structure the meeting?
There's no agenda. There's just a time block, and we just hang out. Bizarre in some sense. You're used to, in any other format, in any other company, you might say, who owns this meeting? What's the agenda? What are we hoping to get out of it? But it's a chance really to come together and share the learnings from the week, obviously talk about new opportunities and new things we're seeing, inviting entrepreneurs to come and meet with us in the space to obviously do that. But there's kind of a trust in the free-flowing trust in each other, and a trust in just having that time block, and therefore learning in it together, sharing in it together, and we'll get through. If something's important, we're going to get through it. But we don't necessarily need to put on an agenda. So in many ways, very different, but very freeing in that sense.
Can I ask you, when you said there about kind of like deal flow and then you updates on where companies are at, I always think there's kind of 4 pillars to venture. There's sourcing, there's selecting, there's winning, and then there's like servicing or helping. Like, if you were to rank yourself 1 through 4, 1 being the best, 4 being the worst, across those, where would you put yourself and why? I think about this a lot for myself.
I call them the 5 S's.
All right, hit me. This is great. Yeah, I want the 5 S's.
Because you mentioned 4, and there's actually a 5th.
Well, what's the 5th? But that's not an S.
So it is. You can make it an S. So sourcing.
Do you work at McKinsey?
Exactly. But just you remember it, right? You're going to touch sourcing, selecting, signing, supporting, and then I think of it as summiting. There's no such thing as an end summit, a peak summit. You could call it separating, but actually it's only a great investment in some sense when the shares are distributed to a broader shareholder base in terms of distribution or the like. I think people forget about in the push for forever funds and forever people forget that an investment actually sort of is consummated at some point. Maybe not the company obviously is not finished, but that's the responsibility. The piece I like the most of those is really that connection of spending the time on connecting up strategy into sequencing of the company, into sort of structure and organization, into operations. Is that work of specific company thinking and execution. I really do think that starts, and there's a harmony between that notion of that sort of diligence and getting to know someone and the work afterwards. In some sense, we make a full, total commitment. And so we're not reassessing, but you're constantly working on strategy, which is, I think, that work of selecting in many ways. In diligence, I think it should not feel like an examination. It should feel more like looking ahead at the future together and stepping into shoes together, which is the sort of work you'll be constantly doing with a founder. Sometimes I'd say it should feel like planning an adventure, not a colonoscopy. And I use planning an adventure because when you plan an adventure, like a real expedition, like there are serious topics you've got to grapple with. What are your resources? What are the plans? Like, which people do you need on the team? Like on the side, helping, maybe in HQ and sort of back it down the mountain. Like there's real serious questions that you have to grapple with. And so it's not like you shouldn't take it seriously, but it should feel like planning an expedition, which is the work you'll keep doing, versus versus that examination. And so that's really where I get my energy.
Are you able to plan expeditions if we carry on that analogy? Because the majority of A investors with a hot company or a company that's raised from great seed investors says, hey, we're not raising, and actually spending the time to build that relationship. And how do you build relationships in a world and a landscape where actually people often raise in very static fundraising blocks?
I think you can create, even if it was in a short amount of time, you can create that feeling. When we're our best, every founder who spends time with us should really be able to say they got a lot out of that meeting. And I'd encourage all founders to take advantage of us, right? Like sometimes there's I'll only pitch Benchmark when I got the perfect pitch. Like that's silly. That doesn't need to be the case. But we're also unique in that you might end up pitching other investors multiple times because they have growth funds and crossover and all this other stuff. We're only early, and so you get sort of a chance of it. But also, we're not going to rejudge you in the future based on what you told us now, because whereas other funds might. And so take advantage of us, and it should feel like we really work hard and aspire to have it feel like the founder got a lot out of that meeting. And the way they get a lot out of that meeting, hopefully, is you really stepped into their shoes together. And there's a certain amount of obviously context you've got to assimilate quickly, right? Like what they're working on, who their customer is, who their aspirational customers, et cetera. But very quickly, trying to move to being in the shoes together, planning that expedition, looking forward. And of course, you don't know exactly how the expedition is going to go and the metaphors, but it should be looking forward, not an examination of the state of today. The examination of today is only a means of sort of taking stock to think about where we're going. And so that's the experience that should be felt. And I think you can feel that and engage in that in any 60-minute kind of conversation. And if it's great, the founder, should say, let's do more.
I've had Sequoia partners on the show before many times, and actually all of them share the same challenge, or biggest challenge, which they say is exactly as you said, actually, which is founders are nervous to approach us and want to do it last with the perfect pitch. That kind of training, go to tier 2s and tier 3s first and perfect along the way. Would you say that's your biggest challenge?
I certainly think it is a challenge. And I'll share two thoughts around it. One is a fun story, and then how we think about, in some sense, the very best founders. A fun story. We had a founder came and pitched us, came to the partnership and presented a while back. And we were talking about strategy going forward and how to think about it. And one of my partners sort of goes, well, when you think about kind of the LTV of a customer, the important thing might be to. And the founder goes, sorry, what's LTV, as in lifetime value? Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't sure. Yeah. And you might say, wow, that's kind of embarrassing. Like they didn't know what LTV was. Yeah. But they're an engineer, and this was a company in its infancy. And obviously, it's great if they know LTV. But the fact that they're willing to say, I don't know, and quickly learn and grok it, is really, I think, the most important thing, that rate of learning. And in fact, I'd say most of us saw it as a strength after that pitch. It would be easy for us to speak of imperfect pitches, right? It'd be easy for us to say that was like a no-go. They don't know what that is. But they haven't lived in that world, and that's okay. They're going to learn it fast. And I think the rate of learning and the willingness to engage in that discomfort, right? Learning is an exciting thing, but kind of an uncomfortable thing to be not knowing very much. And my partner, Eric, has this great saying, which I really like. The very best entrepreneurs are always making mistakes. The really great ones are just making new mistakes each time. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so that slope and pace is the most important.
Do you think that is okay? If I'm honest, to me, I don't think that's okay. I'm sure he's a great founder, and I will miss deals because of it. But with the freedom of information today, with the transparency of podcasts like this, the availability of SaaS materials, basically, that's not an acceptable thing, I think, if you're going to start building a SaaS company. This is the core mechanics of any business in SaaS. And if you're looking at a cake recipe, you know that there's going to be eggs and flour because it's just the fundamentals. It's not acceptable.
In this case, regardless of whether we did or didn't make the investment kind of thing, we won't share anymore. It's not a binary condition for me now, for sure. And I think, look, if the person's, again, there's all sorts of situational costs. If the person's 35, okay, we've got a different situation on our hands, right? Fair. They've had 13 years stereotypically of career at that point. If the person's 21,
It's different. I get you.
And they've spent their entire,
they've come out of university, they're a CS grad.
Doing CS and are an amazing engineer. And if I went into their world on architectures, languages, frameworks, technologies, I wouldn't know some of the latest stuff they might know about. And simultaneously, though, if someone was dismissive of that idea, right, of customer retention, right, if they were dismissive of that idea and didn't care for the concept, obviously, or whatever else, okay, we've got a problem.
Yeah.
If they know that to be true, they just don't necessarily know some of the terminology yet.
That's fair.
Because they haven't done that, and they're willing to acknowledge that versus hide it. That's a superpower.
Okay, so if we're going back to the rankings and we're doing 1 through 5 because you like your 5 S's. So we've got number 1, your best at like strategy pre-deal, like picking.
I if you were to bucket it, I'd then say it's selecting and supporting. Okay. And that's where I derive all my energy and spend all my time.
Do you think VCs really add value?
I think that I see the aspiration and the job as really helping a founder make the very best decisions. It's always their decisions, and it's them making the decisions. But if you think about a couple really important decisions over the course of each year, times 10 over the course of 10 years, round number, you move those odds a little each time. And to do that, I think you really need trust. Trust is the foundation of that. To do that, I think context, high amounts of context and high bandwidth communication filters in. Without trust, though, you can share stuff and they're never going to listen. They're always going to doubt it. But I think trust with context, with high bandwidth communication, tilting those odds each time, leading to a more successful company through their decision making. But where they look back and say that partner really helped them get clarity, maybe help them see slightly differently, that maybe added more clarity, slightly tilted a decision, I think really happens. And that's certainly what I aspire to. I
agree. Do you think most VCs do, though? Often people say on the show, VCs do more harm than good. Do you think that's fair? Because I do worry often, bluntly, with my advice. I'm the first to say, I actually don't know. I've never done this, but let me introduce you to someone who has. Because I'm very nervous of what I say, because people do put weight on it as a founder.
I'd say 2. 1, you should always have the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm, for sure. I've been in some board meetings where investors don't really get the product, don't really get the strategy that has to be pursued. They're trying to apply like procedures and checklists, versus strategies specific to the instance. It becomes a reporting structure, it becomes a distraction, it becomes a management burden for the founder. And so, Hippocratic Oath. The second is, though, I think that it's not that you always have the answer. Part of it is that a founder trusts you to say, hey, I'm working on this, and come to you with it, and you go work on it together. And so I don't think you have to always, in fact, it would be dangerous, I think, to assume you've always got like the perfect answer and opinion on everything, so much as to say, with that context, with that trust, with high velocity, communication, you can go work through it.
I'm so enjoying this. So I had Sam Lesson on recently, and he was like, the best founders, they don't need me. They don't need me. When you look back at your best founders that you've worked with, do you agree with that statement? The best founders don't need you.
I think the best way, like they will have done great things absent an investing partner, sure.
Yeah.
Can it further supercharge that? I think so.
Yeah.
Like you say, maybe of recruiting in some sense, or any sort of, I don't think it was coaching, but per se, but you can't coach height. Got to have it. And so, I think the very best are very capable. I think the very best with a great trusted partner as well, deeply committed to them, can add to that. Go look at even the very best. Go look at Jeff Bezos. He's still got a board, and he's still got, partners who've been with him that entire journey. Their help is not to take away from his success, right, in any stretch of the imagination, to say he couldn't have otherwise, but to say, we all have our fallacies, we all have our lens, and to say, again, helping a founder make the very best decisions, some other perspective, some other challenge, even if you still make the same decision, you probably move forward with more confidence. And so
I always say to my mother, it's like an ice cream with hundreds and thousands of sprinkles on top. Yeah. The ice cream's still great without the sprinkles,
there you go.
But it makes it a bit nicer and better.
Yeah.
No, I totally get you. Okay, so we've got servicing as number 2. We've got selecting as number 1. What's 3, 4, and 5 as we go down the chart?
Again, I really think of them. If you think of investing as betting.
Yeah.
I think you spend a lot more energy on the funnel and winning the first. It's like you're placing chips on a roulette table. And I don't think of it that way. I really think of it, the work we do as making a commitment, not a bet. And if you were to sit around our partnership meetings and the like, you really wouldn't hear the word bet come up very much in that regard. And I think if you listen to many people in the industry talk, you'll hear the word bet. I bet on this, I bet on that, that's a bad bet all the time. And I think if you're more wired that way, you think of it more sort of as that funnel, sort of the sourcing funnel and coverage, to make sure you get exposure to the best bets, and sort of the signing of them being kind of the end of it is the most important. So those would be after the other two for me. In which order, I'll let others tell me.
No, listen, I totally get you, and I agree in terms of terminology. I remember Doug Leone on the show absolutely killed me because I said about like deal. And he was like, no, it's not a deal. We partner with. All right, sorry, Doug.
I do think language really matters.
I do, but also actually, if you speak to founders, quite often they're like, no, you're giving me money for a portion of my company. Let's not like dress this up as like this like magical partnership and union of like, it's a deal. I don't know. I find like second time founders, especially, just like, listen, I get it. You're selling cash with some advice, which is great, but it's a deal. Do you know what I mean?
I think there's a mix, and greatness is the aspiration for the tale that is, rarely experienced on that.
No, I do. I get you. And it is nuanced on different founders. Can I ask, I'm always oscillating between these, and I think I've kind of come to a rubric myself, but there's founder, there's market, and then there's kind of traction. When you think about kind of weighing these three up, how do you weigh them? There's no right or wrong, but everyone has their own approach. How do you think about that rubric between founder, traction, and market? I'm
going to give you an annoying answer in many ways. Yeah, not it depends, but rather it's the integration of it all.
But I thought it was interesting. Nikhil was like, I can't do anything pre-traction. If it's like, if it's pre any data, I just don't know. I have no idea.
I used to do more growth investing, later stage investing. Yeah. And I actually would always push myself and the team on the idea that we should have a point of view of what data should look like. We should be able to have strong theories absent any data. We should always start from like product and customer, not data. And data should be in some sense validation, not learning. Sort of like simply said, maybe like data second investor. And so I'm quite happy doing that personally. And I think even think in early stages, like data can be a trap.
Yeah.
I often say with companies I work with or companies I'll meet with, like they'll be like, oh, we're aspiring to get to X million of revenue, so we grow at Y% for the year. And I'm usually much more like, what do you really want to have proven in the year? What do you really want to have learned in the year? What would be the right customer adoption in the year? And often cases, I'd rather take less growth in the right ways than more growth in the wrong ways.
Yeah. The revenue is always an annoying one for me because it's an output metric.
Yeah.
I'm like, what's the input metric that got you there? Yeah. What's the seed expansion
it's not that you can ignore it by any stretch of the imagination.
Sure.
But when you're in these early stages, and I'd call early, certainly even tens of millions of revenue, not just like one, you're setting up systems. You're setting up learnings and systems for the future for repeatability and scale in the right way. Other success certainly revenue can be empty calories, right? And if you think about it as a diet, like you want to make sure you got a good diet, not empty calories. And so anyway, back to the sort of aspects of it, I really think about it as an integrated system. And so the gut check, the real question I think about a lot, which gets to that sort of holistic nature of it, is how do I imagine recruiting for this? If you think about the journey after investing, if I take something like Benchling, which I've worked with now for 7 years, 8 years, or Lattice, or Monzo, the like, I'll probably do many hundreds of recruiting calls between exec interviews as they change exec teams on that journey, between individual ICs that I might help out with early on. If you then add in other investors you're going to have talked to about the company, conversations like this that you might talk about, you're going to like pitch the company in many ways, hundreds and hundreds of times. And certainly just apply it to the recruiting, which is the core bulk of that. No recruit is like just on how big, how much money can I make? That's a very mercenary recruit too. So the mission matters, like who are they working for matters, and the team and its called. And so like a recruiter is thinking about it in a holistic way. And so we actually just had a partner meeting the other day, and one of my partners was literally before asking any other question, asked my other partner, "Can you recruit for that? Like, are you excited to recruit for that?" And so I think it is this sort of integrated, holistic question that really is a cool one for me. If you say, "Okay, Miles, what do you really look for when you're making a new investment?" More with investor speak. I think the biggest one is what's changing. Like, where's there a gap? Where's there what's new either from their perspective? What's a gap in the market that's opening up? And change begets the opportunity for new, begets the opportunity for dislocation. And then you got to have a founder who is authentic to that, a strategy that can get on the field and work in interesting ways with that business model that you think can be valuable upon success within that change, or the ability for when a founder comes to a creative act to sort of try and make change is the core of being able to really get going. And so
actually it's market timing, even more specifically.
You might call it that.
Yeah.
I don't personally think about it as much from sort of a timing lens, so much as the investigation and the thinking of like, what's different, what's new, what's a dislocation, what's emergent.
Will you take adoption risk? I mean, I think, I had Vinod Khosla on the show before, and he's like, I'll take all the market timing risk in the world, but I won't take adoption risk. And so what he means by that is like, a specific anti-smoking tablet or whatever we want to go for. There's no question that if introduced, adoption will happen, but there's a question of when or if it will at all.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to... There's sort of like, I don't know if you go back to sort of philosophy and economics, there's this idea of like normative versus positive, right? Normative is how things should work. Positive is like how they do work, simplistically said. I think it's dangerous in many ways in investor sort of to think, oh, the world should work this way. And now I'm looking for people who also think the world should work this way, but don't really have the strategy for cracking that open, or there's not a dislocation that opens up the window for that to happen. And so I think that can be... On the flip side, sometimes you think the world should work a certain way and a company's got an advantage in a moment in time with which it isn't working that way. Sometimes that also doesn't happen. Like the world doesn't correct itself. So I think that can be dangerous. Again, I think almost to what we talked about earlier, coming back to the user and like working backwards sort of from that I think can put you in that mindset of that adoption question. And like, timing can sometimes be how can you reach them and efficiency and all of those sorts of things. And I think you can sort of puzzle through that in a way. The force of will can do a lot, but it's got to feel like you've got to feel like the dominoes got tilted over. You're looking here, but the domino chain is sort of happening conceptually in the market or for behavior, or whatever it is. And so I'll sort of happily take that and go on that journey if you feel like the dominoes are really falling.
Well, speaking of like going on that journey, how do you bring the partnership along with you in your excitement in a deal? Do you tag team it up at Benchmark where you say, hey, Chetan, let's get on this together, and then you discuss it as a partnership, but you and Chetan are the leads? How do you bring everyone with you in your conviction for a company?
Yeah, we do a lot of that. Yeah. Like, hey, come join this. Hey, let's go meet together. There's ultimately one person who takes a board seat, right? Manifested that way. But it is again, we're an equal partnership, so it's a whole firm commitment. No person is incentivized to do more, help more one thing versus another. A founder really gets the whole partnership, but obviously they have a principal relationship, a dominant relationship with one person. But we're constantly pulling each other in. Actually, just before I came here, a founder who works with Bill Gurley I'd spent some time with recently and sent me a text like remembering something I'd said to him in a line because he was using it again and again. And so we're always pulling each other into current investments, future investments, sort of in a very fluid way.
It's interesting. You said also about being data second. I actually think reserves are financial mismanagement. And people go, what? And I go, yeah, because fundamentally it's predicated on data most often, like immediate traction in next 6 to 12 months post-investment. And when you look at it, and I'm applying it to the Benchmark portfolio now, but like a Docker of the world would probably not, and I don't know the specific trajectory of the company, but an example for me would be respectfully, Clubhouse. If I were to do reserves, I would have concentrated all my reserves into Clubhouse. Actually, that would have been the wrong decision. Or for Docker, you would have not invested in subsequent rounds of Docker because of traction misleading you. How do you think about reserves management today, given data can mislead you very often?
We really don't think about it very much. If you were to hit the spreadsheet of our investments, almost all the capital we invest is the very first time we partner. And yeah, we have reserves, because tough times happen, who knows what, right? Like we certainly have reserves, but we don't reserve with a mindset of buying more later. We don't reserve with a mindset of, hey, we got some ownership now, we're going to try and buy some later. We're either fully in and it's a whole commitment and then that's what we're doing, or we're not in. And so we don't reserve with a future investment orientation.
I wish I could I was going to say I wish I could record that and play that to LPs because I say very similar, but it is recorded, so that's a rather wonderful thing.
I'm not sure it's the wisest thing per se.
You said beforehand, sometimes how you can pick holes. If I'm not picking holes by any means, but Benchmark are famed on being the Series A investor, and then you actually look and you're like, Airplane.dev, which I think is announced, was the first money in. And then Airtable was the Series C. We had Howie on the show the other day. How do we think about where Benchmark sits in landscape given moving to first money in Series C?
I pulled this the other day. I think it's something like 50 to 60% of all the investments we make, we're the first partner.
Whoa.
Right? I don't want to use the word real, right? But first sort of institutional investor, so to speak. Institutional sounds, so lofty, but that a company has. I think it's something like 30-odd%. We're literally the first investment. We don't use the term incubation. I'm sure there's a bunch of things we've done people would call incubations. We don't use that term. But I think probably about a third of investments are at inception. Not all of those would fit other people's incubating criteria or whatever, but it's really early. And so it's not to say that's really the focus. There are occasionally exceptions.
Do you worry in terms of positioning then, in terms of competing with a very busy and vibrant seed ecosystem? What I mean by that is I'm sure we both know Ophelia at Blossom in London, but she very specifically doesn't do seed because she always wants to be non-competitive to seed players. By doing 50 to 60% as first institutional capital, or that first kind of firm check, you are competitive, I guess, to seed managers.
I think the whole ecosystem, I don't think it's zero sum by any stretch of the imagination. The N of that in a given year, even for that percentage, is 3 companies, right? And so it's not like we're doing 30 that way in a given, so the N is small. There's a lot of new companies formed each year. And so I don't think of us as competitive. I think to our point earlier, some people maybe think of us later, and I would encourage all founders to there's no such thing as too early for when we invest. There's no such thing as not enough traction. We love going on that journey of sort of partnering to help a founder take that raw clay and idea and mold it into something spectacular. So no such thing as too early.
Speaking of something spectacular, before we move on to the AI landscape, which we have to touch on, because I spoke to Harrison actually at length. Great discussion. Thanks for the intro there. But my question to you is, we learn a lot from successes and failures. You mentioned your Lattice, your Benchling. God, I remember you introduced me to Sajith years and years ago when they were not very well known at all. But Benchling, Lattice, Monzo, there's many more. But when you think about your biggest wins, what have been your biggest lessons or takeaways when you reflect on those wins? Because they do ingrain lessons.
I think if you looked at realized, it would probably be GitHub or Segment. If you look at unrealized, maybe Benchling or Monzo. And so on Benchling or Monzo, it's funny, you learn 2 very different things. Benchling really is a visceral, felt story of the power of someone perfectly matched to a totally new market, and a story of what could maybe seem like a small market because it's a vertical market, getting opened up and being the leading provider to grow with that market. If you want a positive feedback loop to small but growing markets with high degrees of market share in them, and a founder perfectly matched to dominate that market, and what could be possible, it gives you a feedback loop for that.
Yeah.
Lived reality. Monzo is the exact opposite in many ways, in that it's banking. Like outside the UK audience, they might not have barely heard of Monzo because it's a UK phenomena, but in the UK there are something like 60, 70 million core checking account users in the UK. Monzo now has 7 million accounts. It's like a tenth of the British population has signed up to this thing.
Do you want to hear the funniest thing? I was at Atomico when you did that deal, and I was meeting with Tom, and all we heard was like, there's a US firm coming. And Europe has this thing, when we hear a US firm coming, we're like, oh shit, everyone's got to go. And I just remember respectfully, just like and I spoke to Tom before and he said this was okay, but you're seeing what others didn't see with Monzo, because he did get some no's.
Yeah, you got a lot, I
think.
Yeah,
he got a lot of no's. But, listen, the journey's still to play out, but you saw something that was right.
Yeah, so, and both of these, by the way, like Benchling was 5 people, Monzo was probably more like 30 people, but about like 5,000 maybe kind of test accounts. It didn't even have the full banking license yet. And so Monzo now is 7 million. It's like a tenth of the British population. I think it's a couple 100,000 small businesses have accounts. It's a feedback loop, right? To strengthen confidence in the idea that a ferocious founder with a sort of no hold back, full, all the elements attack on a market can break through in ways that are unimaginable in many ways. And Tom really did that. He did everything from get a full banking license to build out all the technology from scratch. And this is where, for me, it's a story of a founder, again, incredibly mission driven and ferocious, where it's all against that. Like there's so many marginal and incremental decisions the team makes, and like they're all that way. And I remember when we invested, and then a little later on too, he really wanted to do crowdfunding rounds. And again, the whole mission of the company, right, was it was a bank for everyone, a bank you can trust. And again, it flows into all the decisions. So he wanted to do, just to use an instance of it, an idea of this, he wanted to do crowdfunding, and he'd done, I think, one of them and then another, and then he wanted to do another. And like no company in England had done that many crowdfunding rounds and had that many individual shareholders this early. It was actually at a moment in time where people thought crowdfunding platforms would emerge and pop, because if you got Monzo as your crowdfunding client, like you thought that this was all going to be possible and way more people would do it. And every lawyer we get on the phone with would be like, do you really need to do this? It's really complicated in these ways. And he was just like, nope, we're doing it. And I think it's an anecdote to me. It speaks to sort of that ferocity, that sort of totality of mission of a founder to break through. And to me is like a feedback loop on how special that can be as well.
On founder detection errors, my biggest error is when a salesman founder or saleswoman founder is very good at selling and actually their execution doesn't align to the quality of their sales. That would be my biggest founder detection error. What would you say your biggest is, where you thought you saw something that wasn't there?
The greatest regrets I have are where I thought someone was really, really special and I got too hesitant on market more than anything. And so...
What was an example?
I'll give you 3. Dylan at Figma, Zach at Plaid, and Alex at Scale. And I have enormous respect for all 3 of them. Got to know all 3 of them really early, and I struggled.
When did you get to know Figma? Because there was that intersection with the A when John Lilly did the A, and it wasn't a live product. I mean, there was nothing, and it was kind of in this kind of desert-like zone. The product was developing, but it wasn't released.
Yeah, I spent time with Dylan. Was fortunate to spend time with him. At the round that Kleiner ultimately did, and then also again at when Sequoia invested. It is definitely the one I am most mad at myself for. And my hesitation was I didn't think designers was a terribly big opportunity, a big market. Like the N of designers is not, certainly relative to, like, say, engineers, is tiny. If you go looked at most of your companies, and got a head count of designers, it's a very small N.
Yeah.
At any later stage company, I'm almost certain there'd be like more accountants than there are designers, right? And so if you're thinking about seat software, there's not many. On Figma, the hesitation I had was that I didn't think designers was a particularly large N. I think if you went and asked how many designers there were in many of your companies, certainly relative to engineers, it would be a tiny fraction. I think N of designers relative to accountants at some later stage startups would be tiny.
So what did you miss there?
Yeah, what I missed was that the adoption brought far more users into the product. And I know you conceptually knew it, but I didn't weigh it enough at the time. And that's what eats at me the most, because I think about doing this when I look at products and be product first, is sort of what's that nature of the product. And the nature of design inside a company of digital product like really brings copywriters come in, marketing people come in, product managers come in, engineers need the handoff. There's a lot of people that orbit that asset inside of a company, that workflow inside of a company. And I was like stupidly, myopically thinking of it as a design seat, as design software. And what I should have been thinking about it is as the nexus of collaboration for digital product, of which design is the core stakeholder, but all these other people orbit it and are very involved. And it's, if you go and look at the data at the time, it actually was there. It was in front of me. Sometimes maybe not being data first enough is a miss.
What was the data that showed it?
There were a lot of other.
I remember when it's public, but they were at 4 million in ARR when Andrew did them at 400.
Yeah.
And everyone was like,
Dylan had showed charts. I just it didn't sit in my mind properly enough at the time of all the other non-design users inside the companies using it, and them as active seats, them as paid seats. And I think now I've done this anecdotally with a few teams I work with in later stage teams. If you go ask for their spend on Figma, many of them probably spend more than Slack, which was wild to think about, and I would never have guessed. But when you think sort of first principled about it, the nature of that product, it sort of makes sense. And so how that actually plays out is probably a third of the company, from my surveying, has paid seats inside of Figma, and they pay out 3 times as much as they would for something like Slack. And so the bill and the revenue they're driving is enormous. I didn't appreciate that. And so it's a lesson for me in really thinking about and sort of inspecting, getting to know and understand like what's unique, like what's sort of counterintuitive. And anytime you're getting to know a team and thinking about a product, even post that, if something seemingly unintuitive, or at least intuitive to some, is happening, that's potentially cause for a lot of excitement.
Yeah.
And certainly to be a student of. And I like to think of myself that way. And so it's the one that grates me the most because it was right there. And I didn't wear it enough.
Mike Maple says, like, what secret do you believe that the world doesn't see yet? And I always tend to ask that question. Yeah. What did you miss with Plaid? This
to me would be a story of the way the world doesn't necessarily work the way it should work, hyper-rationally. Plaid really solved OAuth for bank accounts, which was done in an arcane way before penny drops, where you have to wait 6 days. So it was a radical improvement. But the idea that OAuth to your bank account, OAuth in general was a hard problem, was like not that hard. Like Reddit, I think, probably has an OAuth system. Like you can build an OAuth system. Conceptually, the world should work is every bank, and there's, by the way, highly concentrated in the US. So like 5 banks control over 50% of accounts in the US. The idea that those 5 banks couldn't offer an OAuth system to get account and routing numbers, that's all you need, 2 numbers out of them to authenticate. In my mind, it should work. Now they have no incentive to do that, because if they let you do that, it's easier to move money out, and they don't want you to move money out because they make money on you storing money there. That's how a bank works. You get lock-in to other products, but also just you get net interest margin on the core assets you manage. And so no bank has an incentive to actually offer this. And so again, you think user first, incentives in the system. It sort of shouldn't work like this, but it's not a complicated technical product in the grand scheme, so it should work like that. And I got too intellectual about it. And again, amazing founders, like people I feel lucky to still call friends, and just sort of people who even then I knew I wanted to just work with, and that's the magic of this journey. So those are the big regrets.
Yep, I can understand that. The thing that strikes me though when I hear you discuss those, and then also think to LangChain and then some of your hits, including Segment, as well as you mentioned earlier, and GitHub, is actually the breadth of material and landscape you need to cover. And I actually spoke to the Dipsy founders before this, and they said ask him about specialist versus generalist, because he is able to be so broad, unlike many others. How do you think about that breadth and generalist versus specialist?
Yeah. Firstly, I can't help myself. That's, I think, just how I'm wired. I have a lot of curiosity, maybe, too much curiosity. That said, I thought I had a lot of curiosity, and then I really got to know my partner, Peter Fenton. I think he has like clinical curiosity. Even my curiosity has a ways to go to catch up.
What makes you say that about him? Like he just cannot stop?
Yeah. Just sort of insatiable desire to learn. I think most people I know, most friends and others would say that's true of me as well. But when you see someone with it even more so, it puts you in your place. Not that it's a competition for curiosity, but I, in some sense, why the breadth? It's just curiosity pulling me into different places, and usually in many ways very founder driven. You have an inkling of interest in an area, and you meet someone like Tom, and you want to work with Tom. You meet someone like Dylan, you meet someone like Zach, you meet someone like Saji of Benchling. I think myself as sort of a generalist, but really ending up being a specialist in helping founders like that accomplish their dreams, right? To make the very best decisions. And I think of myself as becoming a specialist in not in the same degree, but in many ways in their companies and their situations, and a specialist in helping them connect up that strategy and vision into the sequencing, into the organization. Almost all the great companies are not like a carbon copy replica of a playbook from some other prior either, right? And so there are lessons absolutely learned from the past, but I don't think it's a stamp it out, assembly line process, right? Stripe is not PayPal. At Segment, there was a lot of pressure, and we did also in the positive way learn lots of lessons from Stripe, but we were very different to Stripe, even though we were a developer-sold product. And too much of the Stripe lesson was detrimental actually to being the best version of ourselves. And so I don't think greatness is a carbon copy either. And so I think in order to be the best partner to a founder making the very best decisions, you become a specialist in theirs, but it's about applying like strategies and learning from strategies, not learning procedures. And I think the more you become a sort of vertical specialist, where the more the temptation is to say, here's a procedure, here's a checklist. And I think the very best are not that. And so I can't help it.
Do you feel insecure? And I say this because I do, when I sit down with our mutual friend Nico, and Nico just comes out with the most rigorous benchmarking on CACs for consumer subscription companies. And I'm like, fuck, shit, I'm not as deep as that. Do you get insecure when you hear specialists speak in the depth that they do and go, fuck, I can never be that?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think hopefully can help people get connected to those people for those expertise, if that's really what makes it. And there's a lot else that goes into building a company, and there's moments probably where those metrics are the wrong things, right? Like where benchmarking perfectly to the playbook of that vertical, like you're going to break it in some way. It's going to look different in some way. And I think the generalist, in many ways, I've talked about this a bit before, this idea of sort of being a biologist versus a physicist. And I think the specialist can become a bit more physicist. Like, here's the playbook, here's the rules. And I think of myself as a biologist in that you're constantly looking for like new adaptations, new variants, and curious that, which is why the Figma thing annoys me so much of myself, right? It's a new adaptation. That's the sort of psyche one applies it to. I think if you want to deploy capital, being a specialist is probably good, because you say, hey, if I pass enough of these rules and I have a wide enough portfolio, it'll be good enough. But I don't think like that.
You said about new variants there. The thing I do want to ask is, obviously you led the LangChain deal, one of the hottest and most competitive deals, I think, when you led it and then the subsequent round. My question to you is, and actually Harrison's, how did you first get into AI and LLMs when you did, which was considerably before everyone else, actually?
Yeah, so I was spending time sometime in 2022, probably early, like not that early in the grand scheme of things, right? But I guess earlier than the marginal zeitgeist. We're captivated. You saw the first versions of things which were just sort of spitting out content, right? But you started to see in mid 2022 or so this idea that the models had some amount of reasoning capacity. There's two things I might point to in that one. One is they can do things like know which colors are like each other, which things are, the ability to do math. Now, in some sense, that's learned from the language and it's just statistics at the end of the day. But the fact that those properties were kind of there was fascinating. And then you got things like the React paper, which was sort of this reasoning and actioning and the model kind of giving it feedback to itself. And you started to see, or at least I started to see when I saw those, is like, there might be so much more here. It might be a sort of new computing paradigm in a way. And there's more power in this than just sort of marketing copy. And you combine that with another aspect that I felt could be possible and is proving out to be true, is that ML had been in many ways mostly kind of just like reserved for ML wizardry, right? It was sort of the folks who knew how to build the models, change the weights of the thing. Many teams had ML folks on the team, right, just for their application, just doing stuff with their data. But it was sort of like a separate group than every engineer. And you start to feel, and I started to think in mid or so 2022, every engineer would become an AI engineer, right? AI would be a part of it all. Hugging Face, you go to Hugging Face, it's for the ML wizards. It's like which variant of which model with which, weights. And instead it would be part of every application engineer's like core thinking. And so you would get, I don't know how many GitHub users GitHub has now, but many tens of millions, like 30, 40, probably 50. Tens of millions of engineers would become AI engineers versus like hundreds of thousands of ML scientists. And that would beget the need for an application sort of framework for AI and tooling for that computing environment, which is very different. Like it's sort of stochastic. There's randomness to it. Like how do you measure excellence of it? Like et cetera. In a many model world as well. And there's an opportunity for build to empower every engineer becoming that, which is what you sort of saw happening and certainly what led to partnering with Harrison Langchain.
Can I ask, you said before that the comparison to mobile, which many have made, many have said that actually this is similar to mobile and actually the incumbents will need to shift to it like they did to mobile. You said before maybe that's not the right analogy. Why do you think the comparison to mobile is not the right analogy?
Shifts happen. We want to analogize. And no analogy is going to be perfect. In many ways, I'll compare it more to the idea of what the internet enabled, the mobile enabled. But like both of those were also new distribution channels. And this is not a new distribution channel. So both of them are fundamentally flawed in that way. I'd also argue, though, if you think about distribution, is closer to the internet in that the internet was a distribution channel. It also catalyzed the sort of buying. It catalyzed the idea of sort of buying an internet native solutions, right? You think back to the story of Microsoft and 95 Bill Gates wrote sort of the Pearl Harbor memo of like, we need an internet native kind of like strategy to it, right? It was a catalyst for consumption and sort of change within those organizations more so than mobile. But none of them are perfect. The reason why I think mobile is a more flawed way to think about it is that mobile really was the same sort of architecture and business model as what was before it. The way we architected applications didn't really change. The business models associated with them was pretty much the same. And those things can really lead to disruption, can lead to new startup competing. And most of the incumbents before mobile were the successes in mobile. The new people that won really took advantage of native consumer experience with a ton more time that got unlocked by mobile, because mobile unlocked a ton of consumer time, or what was really enabled by GPS on mobile. And so you get you get Snapchat and Instagram on the native consumer time getting unlocked, but it wasn't a new, maybe you'd argue it was a touch of a new architecture in some ways using a native camera, but it was kind of the same in that way. But what really got unlocked was geolocation services, so things like Uber and DoorDash You might also argue, if you want to get really specific, that gaming did get really unlocked by mobile. And it was because a whole new business model really got supercharged, which was free to play as a distribution strategy. And mobile, again, with consumer time, unlocked a huge amount of consumer time. So distribution into that with a free to play mechanic that changed. But let's put gaming as an idiosyncrasy aside. The internet, though, really changed architecture and business model. We went from on-premise, license-based SaaS, you install it, you manage it, to SaaS 1.0, which was we manage it for you, you buy monthly access to it, and that begot Siebel becoming Salesforce, that begot PeopleSoft becoming Workday, and that was total disruption, right? There was an old architecture and an old business model, and we have a new architecture and a new business model. You then unlocked with that new business model an ability to reach new segments that wasn't maybe as possible before. SMB starts to open up. You get things like HubSpot. Prosumer starts to open up, and so therefore you get all the sort of PLG companies. But that's enabled by that architecture and business model. And I think if AI is to be the force that it can be, I think you will get a new architecture and new business model emerging from it versus what we only see right now, which is kind of a sustaining architecture, which is just that of a co-pilot, which fits on top.
What is the new architecture and what is the new business model?
The way to encapsulate would be this idea of selling the work, not the software. And that we'll move from a paradigm where you might think of it as moving from what we see right now as a co-pilot and moving to what I think about as a control center, where we'll sell an SLA on work, not an SLA on uptime. And so we'll move from a world where we all, as users of software, kind of are like monkeys doing data entry usually. Like, what's most software? It's a database with a form on top of it for users to manage information, put information, and get information out.
And so an example is you set your objectives on your marketing spend and what you want in terms of CAC and LTVs, and then actually, as marketing efficiency engine will go across channels, spend, and deliver you back results.
That might be an example, right? And so we'll move from a world where the users are doing all this work to a world where the application is doing a lot more of the work, right? Where the AI, the notion of agents inside of it, et cetera, is doing it. And where right now, like you go to any SLA for any software, you get uptime, you get support SLAs for questions and things like that. I think there's a world where we move to in the future where like an SLA maybe almost looks more like a BPO would in some sense. An SLA will be, you wanted an efficiency of X on your market, we delivered that. You wanted this many leads from an SDR team, like we do that. You wanted this sort of, you wanted accounting and books closed by 2 days at the end of a quarter. We'll give you an SLA on that, not on the software's up. If it's to be an architectural change and then a business model change with it that's offered up by this, you'll go from Copilot to Control Center. It'll be a UX for a worker, which is dominant, to a UX for managers. You'll go from a seed add-on to software and labor, and you'll go from SLA on like reliability to SLA on like outcomes on work performance. And I think that's what can be offered up by this. You see very little of it so far. I'm starting to meet teams who are thinking this way, but I think AI is offering the potential for that architecture shift. And if we get that the whole seat model, the worker does it, and the product paradigm, the distribution in terms of who you can reach changes because ACVs change. And in that way, I think it will be very different to mobile, which was mostly another UX, but the same architecture, same business models.
Do you think the supply side is ready for that business model change? And do you think the demand side is ready? Supply side obviously being the providers, the teams that we work with. Or do you think they're just layering on traditional SaaS models? And do you think actually the buyers, large enterprises, are thinking about a new business model for the technology that they buy?
Most of what we've seen has been Copilot stuff. And I think Copilot is an Incumbent's strategy. Incumbents own distribution, they own data, they own the UX, and they own a business model that all aligns to a Copilot idea.
When you say Copilot, can you just explain that for the audience?
Think of Copilot as GitHub Copilot, right? Like inline suggestions. Think of it like how most go to any Microsoft product right now. Every Microsoft product now has a Copilot experience, instead of a sidebar, an autofill, things like that. The core product is a layer on top of it, right? It's immediately added in, which is also totally a incumbent strategy. And it's still about sort of supercharging that worker, but still where every user has a seed and every user is doing most of the work. And it works probably, if you think about the evolution here, the models, most of what's rolled out might not be good enough for some of this yet, right? But that's what will come around the corner. If you think back to Salesforce disrupting Siebel, Salesforce launched like 5 years after Netscape launched. Like it might take a moment for that to happen. The Copilot, this idea of I'm still the pilot, I'm still the user controlling everything, and it's sort of like giving me assistive suggestions like GitHub Copilot. It fits into the UX of incumbents, it fits into the business model of incumbents, and they already control all that distribution. And so I think the opportunity offered up to a startup, being a co-pilot for something else, like probably won't be that amazing. And there might be pockets of it where it can really work, but the opportunity to disrupt is to be orthogonal to the incumbents.
Is
right?
it not? I always thought of it as a transitionary period, and what I mean by that is I saw a company the other day that I'm just actually changing it, but say AI for legal, where it's a co-pilot for anyone in the legal industry, but then through the proprietary data acquisition that they get from different user inputs and different user modeling, they're able to then sell the work over time, or they say they will be able to. Is it a transitionary period where you do co-pilot to then be able to sell the work, or do you think we'll see a shift?
I think there's so much holistically in a company that gets wrapped up around a business model. Right. And if you have a co-pilot business model, well, your product is wrapped up around that way, your distribution model is wrapped up that way, sales education is wrapped up around it. And that's why I think business model, which encapsulates product and distribution and end markets, if you can be orthogonal to that, to an incumbent strategy there, and obviously you have to be correct.
What does it mean being orthogonal to an incumbent?
This idea that you would have a UX not for a worker, you'd have a UX for a manager. The idea that you'd sell work and outcomes, not software, right? Like the idea that you're Salesforce, right, selling a cloud subscription managed by us versus Siebel selling an on-premise license, you install, you manage, you get patched for. Like that's orthogonal, right? There's so much wrapped up in the fundamental business as in company architectures and all the systems internally and all their operatings around that it's really hard to just change, right? That's why it ends up being asymmetric competition. It's not to say they can't and they won't. It's a lot more painful of work to be done, of organizational change to enact. And so I think a startup's opportunity is to build their strength and build from scratch that strength in a way that is really orthogonal to those incumbents. And I think it's this idea of this more all-encompassing change in architecture and business model that AI enables in the way that the internet really enabled a totally, enabled SaaS 1.0, enabled a totally different architecture of product model and business model and distribution.
Do you think incumbents see this?
I think incumbents can have a lot of cake with the Copilot idea right now. And that'll be the focus. I wasn't around for it, but when Salesforce launched, I think there'll be some entrepreneur or a few entrepreneurs, hopefully, in the coming year or so, let's say, who channel maybe the Mark Benioff 1999, like no more software, right? Like go if you sort of study that time period, Salesforce Benioff like picketed outside of Siebel's conference, right? No more software, end of software, right? It was a rallying cry. I think there'll be someone who will channel that. It might start in SMBs, it might start in people who couldn't hire workers to do some of that, and sort of the upstarts, the challenges. And so in that proverbial, like, it looks like a toy to start, it might look a little that way, but I think it is a mental model and a strategy that encapsulates a more holistic attack to steal share and expand market, because I think this is a way for market to expand relative to every incumbent that's doing a Copilot.
When we think about like adoption, I think the biggest thing is, like you mentioned Slack earlier and spend on Slack in particular. There is so many companies that have never heard of Slack, especially in Europe. And the reason I say that is because I think we, especially in the tech space and doing what we do, think so much further ahead. And I'm not saying it's just by nature of what we do. I think people will grapple with Copilot for 10 years, enterprise side. If that's the case, investing in selling the work will be a massive market timing problem.
First of all, you don't need, as a startup, too much market or too much market changing hands really fast can be dangerous. As a startup, you could only take on so much. You can only grab so much market share in the grand scheme of things. And if there's enough market being dislocated up for grabs in a year, for you to fully satiate yourself, quite frankly, in that year in terms of what's possible, and you get that stickiness, that's how real power accrues, real strength accrues. You get 60% of the available market share, 60% again, 60% again, 60%, and over 60% each time is of a big absolute number, and so that's all growing. And you look back and suddenly of the market size that now exists for this sort of an offering, you've got like 60, 70, 80% of it, and it's locked in, and you're the main vendor, and you're going to get 70, 60, 80% of the next year's available, and anyone who compete with you can't get all that moved, and is only going to be able to try and compete you away for 20% of what's incrementally available. And you've got all of the cash flow from having won that customer, funding your innovation, your marketing, and your work. And so how much is available, and is that enough to sort of satiate yourself? And building strength that way is actually all you really need as a startup. And two, I think though, this idea of sell the work, not the software. We're all going to have to retrain ourselves. Sell the work, not the software. Have an SLA on and outcomes, not on reliability, is going to be a great value proposition, right? Like I'm sure since you run a very successful fund and media company, you have an accountant. Right?
CFO.
You have a CFO, and CFO, maybe if they're full-time, has external parties that do stuff for them, right?
Course, yeah.
Imagine someone comes along with a brand you can trust, right? Where they say, use me instead of that external firm for like half the price. You sort of be negligent not to switch. Hey, you have to go do some of this work now, and you've got to, okay, that's not going to work. But if I say, my SLA will be on the same performance, same outcomes. Maybe better even, but cheaper and more pleasurable to deal with, etc. Like I think it'll be a very powerful proposition.
Do you worry about the societal ramifications? I agree with that. We can see that. And actually quite a lot of the tasks that could be replaced early can take out quite a lot of workers. Do you worry about that?
Definitely. Definitely. I think the human spirit is indomitable and like pretty good at adjusting, not amazingly fast sometimes, but like we adjust. I trust it'll sort of work itself out in that way. It creates abundance, and I don't think we should sort of constrain the technology's pursuit of that. And there may be consequences to that in terms of redistribution, taxation, all sorts of other things.
I worry about the abundant aspect. When you think about the abundance of content that it will create in terms of the availability for people to create 100 short-form videos from one longer-form video, and it sounds stupid, but that suddenly expands your competition by 100x. Then discovery is the core problem, and content discovery is the core problem. Yeah. What's the solution to that, and how does the next generation of media companies win in that world? Are they AI first media companies?
I think Facebook's doing a pretty good job. Happy to take your 100.
There we go.
And find micro pockets for it all.
Yeah.
I do think though that trust, if we go to media specifically, different from building software, I do think trust comes into question a lot as a function of both imagery and language models. If any investor says AI has a big opportunity, and many of them also say incumbents are advantaged, I do think incumbents have this co-pilot advantage, right? But I think that there's an opportunity for startups in this new architecture. But if they do say those things, I say those things, they should probably have an interesting late stage public company, even public company kind of like pick in some ways. So to the media one, I actually think the New York Times is an interesting position. Who's going to be the arbiter of trust anymore? You're still going to need new information, and you're still going to need incredibly trustworthy. And I think
for existing media brands, it'll actually be a good thing.
I think as a function of LLMs, trust centralizes, and there's huge economies of scale to subscription businesses and advantages. And so it's a silly fun idea, but if we're in media,
you would put a buy on the New York Times.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I think the interesting thing is just like, how do you think about a business model that works in a world of LLMs and content publishers? Because the LLMs don't want to be the content publishers, but they are in many ways.
Yeah,
and I've spoken to some of the largest news publishers in the world, and they're saying fucking ChatGPT is taking all of our visitors.
Yeah. I also think you go spend some time with, which I have, sort of folks at big companies, including a little media. Again, to this idea of a new architecture, they constantly go, but like, where was this pulled from the database? Which database was this in? And so it's such a new mental model to break from.
Is that not because of libel though? like so much of like, especially news. I spoke to I can't name him, but like one of the biggest media magnates in the world. And he was like, they'll never be able to touch us because libel.
You have some of those consequences, but just put aside like why you might think that way in terms of like why that's a good thing for your business model, but just mentally, the idea that this doesn't exist in some database somewhere that was queried when you put in that query and it retrieved and got that thing is like a total change in all application architecture, how applications work, mental models that we have, which is I think what opens up, what we're talking about, this whole opportunity. But it's like such a break that I think is what is also exciting.
There's some things I just have to ask, because there's a lot of like tropes that venture investors are saying about AI today, which I don't often know how to respond to. A lot of like, they're all just wrappers on top of large language models and just wrappers on GPT layers. How do you respond to that?
I think there are some obviously ones that are not that already, right? And so think about what's happened in some. I'd point mostly probably to imagery, things like Midjourney or Runway ML and video and some of these other things, right? Clearly kind of not wrappers in those ways. A lot of what has happened in SaaS, and certainly what we see the most of in the news because incumbents are doing it, is the Copilot idea. And I think Copilot is an incumbent strategy. Is that a wrapper around the model? Sort of, in a way, right? I think they're doing a bunch of other stuff to it, right, for this new application paradigm. But it's that. We at Benchmark are starting to see, and what we're really excited about is what we're just talking about, this idea of this new architecture, this idea of sell the work, not the software, that you have an SLA on outcomes, not reliability, a UX for the manager, not the worker, et cetera, right? This sort of fundamental change. And we're starting to see those ideas really percolate. A lot of it, though, is things that are kind of just becoming available. You do need better models for it. You probably need some fine tuning around it. Fine tuning available to startup is only just starting to happen, right? Mm-hmm. You could have been a savant and maybe taken open source models, but the open source models weren't that good until Llama 2 more recently. And so you were fine tuning, not good enough. Now you could fine tune better, and fine tuning as a service is available. How to sort of wrangle the stochastic, thing is hard. People have, kind of had like 9 months to do that now, so it's still nascent in it all. And so when you want to sort of offer up a totally new experience in this way, you need time to figure it out, right? And so we're starting to see that, like boots on the ground, more anecdotes of it. But I'm in some sense not surprised that we maybe haven't yet, right? Like go back to history. As I said earlier, Salesforce 5 years after the internet came about. Facebook didn't launch. I'm not to say this is, every epoch's different, right? And so Facebook, sometimes we think they happen really fast, but it takes a while. So Facebook didn't launch a native mobile app until 2012, right?
It was post IPO, wasn't it? Was it
I think the IPO was around, I forget whether it was pre or post, but it was 2012. And so give or take around that time period. You want a story of like Microsoft? Microsoft acquired Nokia in 2013. Right, like it's not just sort of fun history, but I'm not surprised if we just look at this specific situation, the factors, that it might take a moment to really embrace what's fully possible with this new architecture.
When I think like our job as investors is basically, where do we think value will accrue most significantly, and then intersect with those opportunities. When I look at it, I'm like, there's application layer and there's infrastructure layer, and then I think about actually where do I think value accrues, and I think it's actually more infrastructure layer for the time being, which is democratization of fine tuning, security, kind of democratized data acquisition for startups as well, and cleansing. Do you agree with me that actually like infrastructure layer AI is where it's most exciting right now?
Obviously with investment in LangChain, and we have a few others at Benchmark, Cerebrus, which is an AI chip for training and inference. We backed a team that worked on and was the leads of PyTorch and has got a new company, and some others. We certainly think that, and to the LangChain point, the idea that every developer is going to come to building AI native, AI enabled applications, right? Incumbents are going to enable it. New companies are going to fully embrace it, and they're needing new tooling and new frameworks for that environment. Like I think is absolutely happening. I think in the arc of time, if it is a shift like the internet was in many ways, the applications, which might not look like an applications, right, in the way that we think of them, but might look more like, this control center idea will have profound amounts of value to them, and will probably also pull through even better infrastructure in the way that, Facebook became some of the biggest contributors, to MySQL and a bunch of open stuff. Like, it pulls through the infrastructure. That, I think, will be in the arc of time.
Do you think the majority of dollars going into new AI venture deals today will go to zero?
Maybe a bit to my comment earlier on diet. Like, I think there can be a lot of high fructose corn syrup of adoption. Like, there's an amazing magical moment and a wow, right? When you go experience ChatGPT for the first time, or some of the imagery models for the first time. The rate of adoption of like signups to some of these things is just astounding. And so I think if some investors have been trained, again, with a
data first, deal
flow, rules checklist mindset, and to the point of thinking about, like, some of these like are off the charts on some of those, right? And so if you think from that paradigm, like, they're amazing. I think when you think about sort of enduring need for some of these and long-term solutions, you can make the argument they look a little more like a high fructose corn syrup diet. TBD if they go to zero, right? Great teams will reinvent. Great teams will use that to maybe do something else. So, situation specific. But I think if your mindset was a little more like it beat the metrics and other things, you always want to get lucky, but you'll definitely be hoping you get lucky. Potentially in evolution of them.
I'm already starting to see actually the churn take place, which is like the experimental corporate budgets, which were like 1 or 2 seats, but they were at Walmart.
Yeah.
You're seeing them churn already, which I think does start to happen.
Yeah.
No, I totally get you. Can I ask you, when it came to LangChain, how did that deal go down?
More than half of what we do is the first partner, probably a third kind of at inception. As one was exploring more of what was possible with things like sort of React and the agent ideas, and this idea that every developer would become an AI developer versus just the ML wizardry. Harrison very deftly but like without grandiosity, put out an open source library with the beginnings of abstractions for making agentic behavior and now a lot more around retrieval and other things easier. And we just started spending a lot of time together. It was probably 3 or so months before we ended up actually investing. We, talk about what was happening. We talk about his framework. We talk about, sequence, sort of strengths to be building now, et cetera, and just build that relationship. I never pressured him to say, you got to start a company. There were some people who pressured him to say, you got to start a company, but like, that's got to be a founder's calling. You can't unfound once you found. Like, it's a real responsibility. And so he then said, hey, I want to go do this. And I said, great, like, let's partner. And it's been a privileged journey since. Do
you worry about too much money too soon? I know they obviously subsequently raised another round pretty quickly after yours. I saw it and I was like, well done. Fuck, that's a lot of cash. Do you worry about too much money too soon?
Definitely. We probably could have taken more. Probably could take more now. And so, but just because you could say no to more doesn't mean you shouldn't say no to anything, kind of thing. I think also about the person, right? Some folks would let that all go to their head, would spend frivolously, and so it's situation specific, right? The culture that has to be imbued in the company, of which more capital makes it more important to make sure you imbue that, but it almost poses the foil and the tension, but it helps clarify it, and you still need to keep focused on it. But if you clarify it, it'll strengthen it. Is that it's all investment. It's got to be fruitful investment and not wasteful investment, right? I think you can run the risk, but I don't think it's definitive that happens. And so, at LangChain, obviously, we have more capital than we need right now. But the bottleneck's been hiring great people and the initiatives we want to work on, and that's driving investment and pace of investment versus we have the capital, so why not? Final one before we touch on marathons, which I do just have to touch on. I'm so excited for that one. What do you think the venture world believes or sees that you think they've got wrong? What's a misconception that venture has about the AI world? That everyone says to me, what I've learned now is that actually the incumbents are going to win. Yeah, I think that Copilot is an incumbents game. We're seeing a lot of Copilot, but I don't think I think that misses what is possible. And I think that the new architecture, a new business model associated with it, is starting to happen, is around the corner to make work, will be very orthogonal. It won't be new distribution like the internet was a way to reach customers that you couldn't otherwise reach, right? Or mobile. And so it's not going to be a distribution opportunity, but it's going to be offers the opportunity to be a real architectural shift and holistic company shift that I think great founders are starting to take hold of. And so the opportunity that's there that maybe is beneath the surface of just the Copilot ideas.
I could look like a total twat for this, but if you just played on that it's not a distribution opportunity, what if it is? What if you sell the work and not the service? That changes entirely the value of UI, actually, and it may remove or create a chasm between the device and the user entirely, which may create distribution opportunity in the real world.
That could happen.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that could happen. I also think it could unlock segments, which is different to sort of being the means of distribution, right? But change of business model here might unlock segments that were previously not served as well. In the same way that, an architecture of SaaS allows you to sell to SMBs and do PLG in a way that's very different, right? Sort of SaaS 2.0. And so that might be possible here, but unlike the internet, which literally allowed you to reach customers, through this one means, not one means, right? It was global infrastructure, global internet in a way that you couldn't before. It's not quite the same in that way, but I do think it could be a catalyst for consumption and enabler of new market segments to reach if you fully kind of embrace it.
I want to talk about running before we do a quick fire. I need just some help, genuinely. What's your pre-run nutrition?
Nothing.
You don't eat anything?
No.
Night before, no, can't.
Before a race?
But you're going to run 30, 40 miles.
I don't do that very often, but before a 10, 15 mile weekend hill run or whatever, my secret to life is a chocolate croissant most days.
Wow.
So probably a chocolate croissant and coffee.
Why? I'm not being rude. That's just shit.
Chocolate croissants are wonderful items and give great joy. And how can you be sad if you had a chocolate croissant each morning?
Okay. What about post?
I can't say I'm very good about anything specific. So let's try to eat healthy.
I just don't think you eat much.
There's that too.
Yeah. Do you have a training schedule?
No. I used to do a lot. I was very fascinated in high school and college by the question of just how far can you go really? That book, Born to Run, Dean Karnazes, has this sport called adventure racing, which is multi-sport orienteering. And I do 60-hour races. I'd do ultra marathons. I'd run a 150-mile multi-day stage race thing. And so I was just really fascinated by how far can you go. And I wasn't the fastest for sure, but I usually thought I could outlast someone. I enjoyed all of that. And there's just the challenge of that question. And I would spend a lot of time on nutrition in those days. So pre-race, the sort of paleo diet was big at the time. So I did a lot of a paleo diet. You've got to make sure if you're doing long triathlons, I did sort of a half Ironman. I never did an Ironman, but I did a half Ironman triathlon. The amount of salt you're doing and other sorts of things. I'd try and find I really ended up liking Honey Stinger as a brand for gels and stuff. And so I spent a lot more time on that then. The best person to ask now would be my wife, who's a marathoner, probably the 100th fastest marathon in the US, qualifies for Olympic trials for women. And she's got all of the stuff down. These days I have a kid and I'm a recreational runner. So I don't add extra stress for it by having rules. I just go out to enjoy it. 60
hours you mentioned. What do you do? And this was from Chris Pike. What do you do when your body just says no? What does your mind tell yourself? So mine says just one step more. Yeah. Can you do one step?
Yeah.
What do you tell yourself?
Just one more step. Keep going. Keep going. That 60 hour we did. We probably did 250 miles or so of ground we covered. You go through 2 nights. And so the first night you're in northern Maine, right by the Canadian border. One team actually got arrested because they crossed over, they got lost because you're in the woods with a map and compass, no GPS. and one team like got lost and ended up crossing into Canada and got arrested. Not badly, but they're like, the cops came to them. We ended up in a small town the first night, and a McDonald's opened up at 5 a.m. as we passed through, and we slept on the benches of McDonald's for an hour. I've never felt worse waking up from that. And then the next night, there were sort of manned checkpoints, you might get to, where like there's staff and you actually physically check in, and like if you're going to drop out, there's probably a car that can take you a few hours later, like back to the town and other things. But there's something they set up fires or warmth and stuff like that. So we slept on the ground, and you do it as a team. So I had two teammates racing with me, like spooning each other, with a emergency heat blanket, like on the ground for like an hour and a half. And you never want to get up, but you just get up and you start walking or get on the bike. It's a bizarre experience.
That is just extraordinary. Listen, I want to do a quick fire where I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Great.
Okay, so you mentioned that, having your first child. What do you know now that you wish you'd known when you had your first child? You can call yourself up and give yourself that advice.
I don't know that something that way jumps to mind. I'd say I think we're all really relational beings, and I've noticed myself, I think, change in response to my son. I think he brings out a better version of me. He makes me more present. He makes me more patient. In part, he just doesn't give two craps about what's going on with my day, right? And I think that's a good thing in many ways, and has made me a better person. And I think the idea that, my son unintentionally, obviously, right, can do that, speaks to sort of the relational aspect of humans. And we're all doing that to each other every day in our own ways, right? It's made me more vigilant to how I show up to people, and that. So that's probably how it's, I don't know, it wouldn't be advice for myself before I had it, but would be the way in which it's affected me so far.
What was the most striking example of zero interest rate environment in your mind?
I'm sure we could list out a bunch. I would say that the more exciting thing is how the leadership to learn from of how some have changed and reacted post it. And so we can all make the name the lists of the 2020 to 2022 timeframe and some of the silliness. But I think the more interesting lessons to learn is from how great leadership's reacted. And so for Toby at Shopify to make an acquisition and then divest it I think within a year, maybe it was a year and a half, like not very long, for an organization to make a big move and say, nope, we made the wrong decision that fast, and not get locked into it, not get locked into the ego of having made the call and wanting to look right, but to be so truth-seeking, to be able to recognize the wrong decision and correct it at that scale. Like, that's something for everyone to learn from. Changes like this offer the opportunity, I think, to take lessons like that.
Which less well-known firm do you most respect?
I'll tell you a person who actually now has a firm. He might hate me he's so less well-known by intention that mentioning him may piss him off, but I hope not. He used to be at Sequoia, and Sequoia, has a full website with lots of information, and every investor has like a profile with like questions, and he never did the questions. And I think he's just said like, get in touch. But he is both a great investor and has taught me a lot and been very kind to me. So I have a lot of thanks and gratitude for him. But Michael Abramson, his ability to do back of the envelope math to sort of distill complexity into the few things that matter and have real clarity of thought. I've learned a lot from him on that and by example. And so I'm very grateful to him. He happens to now have a firm, so he fits your question, but that would be the person.
Who's the best board member that you've sat on a board with?
My partner, Eric.
Why Eric?
I think there are two things that, two expressions in venture that I don't like and think differently about. And I think he embodies the way I think you should think differently about them in the context of a board too, in a relationship. One is founder friendly. Like, I don't think you should be founder friendly. Not that you shouldn't be friendly, obviously, but I think the higher purpose is like founder respect. And And friendly can imply like cheerleading, yes, person, etc. And I think to honor and respect a great founder, means sharing truths. Maybe not saying the easiest thing to be saying, maybe saying the uncomfortable thing to say. And I think that is like respect, and so I kind of like founder respect and founder friendly more. And the other would be, I think first call is a very reactive mindset. And so venture always talks about wanting to be the founder's first call. I think of it as first to call and being proactive, right? Obviously not obnoxious, it's not your company, right? But being proactive versus just reactive. First call implies lots of reactivity. I think Eric is, if you looked up his phone and looked at who he's called in the last, couple days or whatever, he'd have called a lot of his founders, and maybe with ideas, maybe with follow up on things, but like being active, proactive, and having real respect for their greatness and what's possible, and so deeply committed to that. And make no mistake, his hands are not on the steering wheel. He's like in the pit crew, and the founders very much driving the car. The trust he builds and then manifests to the point of helping founders make great decisions to sort of dent that curve. I'm very impressed with.
What's your biggest investing mistake between 2020 and 2022?
Well, I think I made one investment between like end of summer 2020 and end of 2022. So if I have a mistake, exactly. So if I have a mistake, it would be like that one, and I don't regret. So we get very specific on what's a mistake. So no, it's not a mistake. But I'm sure in that period of time there was companies I should have invested in. Yeah. It's early, obviously, in all of that.
What's been the hardest part of getting used to the Benchmark partnership?
I can't help myself, but sometimes think about later stage things, or like flexibility, probably comes with the curiosity in many ways, not entirely, right? And having one main manifestation of that channeled into early stage partnership, there's pain in being focused in a good way, right? Like I think Steve Jobs has sort of that famous saying that I really like. You only know it's focused when you're like deeply troubled by all the things you're saying no to, where they feel like such good ideas, but you're still saying no to them. Toby, speaking of Toby and responding to Zerp, I think he also said like, the main thing is to keep the main thing, and that's really hard to do. But forces excellence and is productive pressure. So that's probably the biggest thing.
A final one for you, Miles. What's the most recent company investment, and why did you get so excited?
LangChain, which we've covered.
And what is the 10 years out for LangChain? Like if you'd project, I think it was Chaitin, on one show said like venture's a game of upside maximization. When you plot a graph of if all the stars align, what could LangChain be? What could it be? Yeah,
I think we have, as we talked about, there's tens of millions of developers becoming AI developers. And it's sort of a new computing paradigm, right? Like it's not retrieving from the database, it's generative. And the framework to build AI apps for every developer and the tooling around that new paradigm is the focus. If you want sort of trying to analogize recently, you might look at things like Next.js and Vercel, in that journey. If you want to go to the past, you might think about Rails and things like New Relic around it, which were tooling and monitoring. You might analogize and think about things like Docker, which made a lot of development much easier by Dockerizing it. There was a new framework for doing it all, and empowered. I think there are quite literally tens of millions of developers with Docker accounts now. It was a way of building applications containerized. That will happen for AI apps, and I think that's the exciting opportunity to chase.
I mean, this only took 6 years to happen. So thank you so much for joining me today, and it's been such a pleasure, man.
Thank you, man. Good to hang.